welcome back to the Strong Ambitions powerlifting channel. My name is Cheung and I am a powerlifting coach. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to not overshoot your RPEs in your top set or working set in your training. Now, if you haven't already seen the previous video where I discussed why you shouldn't be overshooting your RPEs, go check it out here. Otherwise, let's begin. So the first strategy of trying to not overshoot your RPEs is learning from the past. So there is a saying that goes, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Now, this quote really applies to you if you are someone who often overshoots their RPE and you often find yourself either frustrated or even surprised that you end up overshooting so frequently. So if this is you, then it's probably an indicator that the process that you are taking to warming up and working towards your top set or working set at an RPE is not working for you and it's not serving you well. Specifically, it's not serving you well in being able to make the right decisions to being able to hit your RPEs more accurately. So if you don't actually revise your process of warming up towards your top set or working set, then you are going to be bound to overshooting a lot more frequently in the future as well. And so no level of wishful thinking is going to be able to change that. So it will take a little bit more self-awareness in order for you to be able to admit that you're probably doing something wrong or something less optimal. And you are going to need to swallow your ego a little bit more so that you can actually develop as a lifter and even as a person as well. So if you are unsure of what part of the process that you need to improve on, you can always have a conversation with your coach if you have one, or a coach, or if you don't have access to a coach, then you can always speak to an experienced lifter to just get their opinion on what you can improve on in your process. Or you can just watch the rest of this video to see which points apply to you most. So the second strategy of preventing overshooting is to avoid deciding what load that you want to hit or that you think you are going to be able to hit before the session has even started. So this is a common problem that I see with less experienced lifters or less mature lifters, where with regards to discussing, their upcoming training sessions, they often talk about, what weight that they think that they will have on that day, or, deciding what they want to be able to hit on that day. Now, when you do that, you essentially turn a RP prescription in your training towards a fixed load prescription in your training. So rather than actually working towards a weight that is at a given intensity, you've already decided that you're going to be working towards a specific load. Now, this completely defeats the purpose of an RPE prescription in your programming. The whole point of an RPE prescription is that it allows you to be able to auto-regulate to the capacity of performance that you have on any given day. And the truth is, you don't actually know what you have on that given day until you warm up to your last warm-up set. So your last warm-up set is actually the point when you actually need to decide what load to put on for your RPE prescription. So the lesson that you need to learn is that you need to trust the process of the programming, especially if you are working with a coach. One thing that's actually worth appreciating is that the trajectory of your week-to-week top-end performance doesn't necessarily always go upwards continuously. It's important to remember that auto-regulating with RPE does go both ways. So, if your strength level isn't there that day because you're either not feeling too well, or if you're feeling a little bit more fatigued, then that RP prescription may force you to pull back a little bit more. But if your strength is there on that day, then that RP prescription will allow you to be able to go up. So you need to trust the process that if things are not moving in the direction that is expected to, then it's up to your coach to be able to manage and manipulate the training dose in your program accordingly. So it's important to remember that you should avoid overreaching your responsibility as an athlete in actually influencing the actual training exposure. So remember, it's up to your coach to decide on the exposure within the training program, and it's up to you as an athlete to follow and execute a plan as best as you can. So the third strategy of preventing overshooting is to have a consistent warm-up routine. So having a consistent warm-up routine involves having, firstly, an effective movement plan that prepares you for your main lifts, as well as a set prescription of sets, reps, and loads leading up to your warm-up set before your first top set or working set. So the reason why it's important to have a warm-up routine that's thorough as well as consistent is that, firstly, it obviously prepares you as best as you can to be able to perform best in your training session, but also it puts you in slightly more consistent condition in order for you to be able to predict your top set or first working set more accurately. So it's probably useful to also keep the rest times between your warm-up sets slightly more consistent as well, leading up to your last warm-up set, where you do need to decide what your first set is going to be. So let's use an example. So let's say you hit your top set RPE accurately the week before. When you work up to the same last warm-up set in this week's training, you can then compare how the last warm-up set felt this week compared to last week. And then you can decide whether it felt easier, it felt harder, or if it felt the same. And so depending on how much the RP of your last warm-up set has changed, you can then decide whether to go up or go down, or stick with the same load as your top set from the previous week. Obviously, over time, as you get stronger, your last warm-up set may need to change. And as a rule of thumb, I would often consider using a different last warm-up set if your last warm-up is consistently at least 2 RPEs easier. So let's say that 100 kilos is often about RPE 7, but nowadays your 100 kilos often feels like RPE 5. So what you would need to do is you will need to increase the spread of your warm-up sets leading up to your last warm-up, as well as increasing the actual load of the last warm-up set as well. So the full strategy of how to not overshoot your RPEs is using a mathematical protocol to predict your top set RPE. So using a mathematical protocol is all about figuring out what the percentage is for a single unit RPE difference on your RPE scale. So let's use an example. Let's say you hit 100 kilos at RPE 7 as a single, and you need to work up to RPE 8, and you decide to increase the weight by 5% to 105 kilos, and you ended up hitting it for an RPE 8 single. Then that 5% difference is equivalent to a single unit RPE. So every time that you need to work up to an RPE 8 single and you hit a certain weight at RPE 7, all you need to do is increase the load to 5%. If, on the other hand, increasing your last warm-up set by 5% leads to an RPE 9 single from RPE 7, then that 5% represented a jump of 2 RPE units. So in order to figure out what your RPE 8 should have been, what you'll need to do is divide the 5% by 2, which will give you 2.5%. And so a single unit RPE is 2.5%. And so in future, if you are working up to an RPE 8 single and you hit your last warm-up set at RPE 7, what you will need to do is to increase the load by 2.5% to most likely hit your RPE 8 single. And from my experience, for most lifters, an RPE unit difference is often anywhere between 2 to about 4%. So the fifth strategy of preventing overshooting is to actually just settle for a mild undershoot. So settling for a mild undershoot is unlikely going to undertrain you or anything like that. And just because you didn't hit exact RPE probably isn't a big deal at all. So when a coach programs you a top set or a working set at an RPE, there's normally a tolerance of plus or minus on either side of the RPE scale. And this is inherently because that predicting your RPE load is a very subjective process. If you did undershoot and if you were to repeat that same load again, there's a possibility that you may elicit a higher RPE at that second time that you hit the same weight. So for example, let's say you hit 100 kilos at RPE 7.5 and you needed to hit RPE 8. There's a small chance that if you were to repeat 100 kilos again, you might hit it at a higher RPE. And this is going to be slightly more relevant to people who generally have lower capacities for high intensity work. Consequently, if you didn't settle for that mild undershoot and you ended up accidentally overshooting, that overshoot may potentially accumulate fatigue towards your subsequent working sets as well. So the risk of overshooting may not actually be worth it in the long term. So from the perspective of a performance monitoring purpose, a coach can still predict what your top end estimated 1 rep max is, even from a slightly undershot RPE set. So the sixth strategy of preventing overshooting your RPEs is not convincing yourself that what you can hit is dependent on willpower. So this is another common mistake that I often hear from lifters with less experience. So the situation that I see is that after performing at a set that was most likely at the prescribed RPE in the first place, sometimes the lifter says to themselves that they can increase the weight and still hit it at the same RPE from just sheer willpower alone. And you often hear this all the time as well. And you'll hear people say, oh, I reckon I can hit X kilos at RPE 8. Or they'll say, I'll make X kilos move at RPE 8. And my response as a coach is that if you could increase the weight and hit it for the same RPE, why was the last warm-up set moving at a higher RPE than it should have in the first place? Now, if the response was, I wasn't putting maximal effort in it at all, then what they should have been doing in the first place is to treat all of the warm-up sets as if they were, a 1 rep max attempt. So you approach every set with maximal intent. Another response that I might also hear as a coach is, oh, I misgrooved that last warm-up set, which firstly could be true if it is a slightly more novice lifter, but if it isn't a novice lifter, then it's probably a reflection upon the lack of technical intent when approaching the warm-up sets. Both of the last two responses are two good reasons why it's important to be diligent and intentful when it comes to approaching your warm-up sets. Consequently, this is one of the advantages of RPE prescriptions, as they essentially reward good behavior that is conducive to training performance. So it's generally the case that with less experienced lifters, they'll often go through the motions when it comes to their warm-up sets. And so, it's important to actually pay attention to your technical execution as well as having maximal effort when it comes to your warm-up sets. So the 7th strategy of preventing overshooting your RPEs is using a velocity tracker. Now, this is going to be one of the more expensive ways of preventing overshooting your RPEs. And what a velocity tracker is that it is a device that attaches to a barbell, or it's either inbuilt into the barbell, where it tracks the velocity that the barbell moves when you come to execute your lift. And the idea behind it is that, when it comes to moving a barbell at higher intensities or higher RPEs, the barbell will generally move at a slower velocity. And so the idea is that you can map out your RPE scale at different barbell velocities. So an advantage of using a velocity tracker is that it can actually encourage a more maximal intent for achieving a highest speed possible for every single lift, including the warm-up sets. Another advantage is that it can also encourage the lifter to execute the lift more technically well in order to maximize the efficiency of moving the barbell. So by having a device that is actually monitoring you, it can encourage you to take your sets slightly more seriously as well. So the way that you would use a velocity tracker to predict your RPEs is to go through a protocol where you map out your velocity profiles across the RPE scale. So this may include setting a day aside to perform an AMRAP set where you map out all the velocities across the reps until you reach an RPE 10. So ultimately what the velocity tracker does is that it adds an element of objectivity to rating your RPEs, which is inherently a very subjective process. So by adding that element of objectivity, you end up making your decision making to be based on something that's a little bit more objective, which can help improve your judgments of choosing your top sets in long term. So once you've built your velocity profile, you're going to be able to make better decisions when it comes to deciding what your top set is going to be once you find out what the speed is of your last warm-up set. So by combining the use of using a velocity tracker and the use of strategy number 4, you're going to be able to come up with a much more reliable process of being able to hit your top set RPEs a little bit more accurately. So there's two things that you need to take into consideration before you go out and order yourself a velocity tracker. So the first thing is that they can be quite expensive, as I mentioned before, and they can cost you anywhere between $300 to about $2,000. And the second thing that you need to take into consideration is the standard of your lifting technique of your main lifts. In order for your velocity tracking to be reliable, your technique needs to be at a level where it is proficient and it is also consistent as well. And so if you are someone whose technique is still not quite there and it's not quite consistent, then it's probably worth focusing on improving your ability to be able to perform your lifts well first before you consider using a velocity tracker. So the 8th strategy of preventing overshooting your RPEs is going to be asking your coach. So your coach, if you have one, is going to be another trustworthy source of rating your RPEs, as they are generally going to be slightly more emotionally removed from the decision making of judging your RPEs. Obviously, your coach is a human being and they may not necessarily be super accurate when it comes to rating your RPEs, but as you work with a coach over time, they're going to be able to pick up on and learn, what kind of lifter that you are, whether you're a slow lifter or a fast lifter over time. Additionally, what a coach can do is your coach can also be paying attention to your technical execution, especially when you are working up towards your last warm-up set. One of the things that they could do is they could also, spot, certain tendencies that you may actually have when it comes to hitting those higher intensity loads. And so by being able to provide that technical feedback, you might have a better idea on what you need to focus on in order to maximize technical proficiency with your top sets. And this can actually influence your RPEs in a positive way as well. A good example would be, let's say you are performing squats and you are generally someone who tends to go onto their toes when they do a squat. Your coach can give you feedback by giving you a cue for you to focus on, so that a weight that would have been, RPE, let's say 8.5, because your technical execution was there, it might end up being RPE 8 instead, because you've executed the weight potentially better. So the 9th strategy of preventing overshooting is using other lifters' opinions. So if you don't have a coach, or if you don't have immediate access to a coach, you can always ask the opinions of other lifters around you. If you're surrounded by slightly more experienced lifters, you may ask them for their experience of what your RPE is when you come to perform a set. Obviously, when it comes to asking the opinions of other people, you should take what they say with a pinch of salt, and be careful not to ask individuals who tend to be overly enthusiastic with you lifting heavy weights, or overly zealous with your with judging your RPEs. It does take a level of maturity, to be able to give a sensible and more useful answer, so you can best make good decisions when it comes to choosing what weight to hit for your top sets or working sets. I occasionally have seen other lifters who put up polls on social media to ask people what they think their RPE is, but I'm generally not a big fan of using social media whilst training. And so, if you don't have another coach with you, or if you don't have other lifters that you're training around, sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and make the decision for yourself. And if you do end up overshooting, then you can just learn from the mistakes when you move forward. So the 10th strategy for preventing overshooting is considering your technical competency. So it will take a little bit more humility when it comes to, revising where your technical competency is. And so what you will need to do is review where your technical ability is when it comes to hitting weights at the higher end on the RPE scale. So for example, are you someone who generally has technical breakdown in a certain way when it comes to hitting higher intensities? Or are you someone who's actually experienced enough that you can maintain your technical consistency when it comes to grinding out weights? And so if you are someone who generally has technical breakdown when it comes to higher intensities, then when it comes to making jumps towards hitting your top set, you may take a slightly more conservative approach when making the jumps. So another perspective of rating RPEs is technical RPE. And so what technical RPE is rating the amount of reps in reserve that you can maintain, with consistent technique. So for example, if you hit a top single at RPE 8, which is a technical RPE, what you are referring to is that you have 2 reps left in the tank whilst being able to maintain that level of technical consistency. And on top of technical competency, you may also want to consider your injury history and status as well. So what you may want to consider is, whether you are currently rehabbing and recovering from an injury, or if you have just recovered from an injury. When it comes to rating your RPEs or making jumps to finding what your top set is, you may want to be a little bit more conservative with that as well. So the 11th strategy for preventing overshooting is judging your rep by the slowest portion of the rep, not the fastest. So there's a really famous saying that goes, you are only as strong as your weakest link. And this really pretty much applies to judging your RPEs. So when you perform a repetition, the speed that you move through in a concentric portion of the repetition isn't going to be uniform. And so for most people, there's often going to be a sticking point that's somewhere in the middle of the range of motion. One thing that you need to understand when it comes to sticking points is that they will vary from person to person. And, if you are someone who has a sticking point in the mid-range, you will often decelerate before you then re-accelerate again to finish the repetition. So when it comes to judging your RPEs and then increasing the load accordingly, you have to anticipate that slow portion of that sticking point is only going to get slower when you increase the weight. So when it comes to judging your RPEs, you need to take that into consideration accordingly. So the 12th strategy for preventing overshooting is going to be using the reps in reserve scale, or the RIR scale. So when it comes to RIR, or reps in reserve, and the RPE scale, Some coaches will often use them as synonymous scales, so they will use them interchangeably, but some coaches might use them differently. So personally, as a coach, I use these scales synonymously. So, RPE 9 is equivalent to 1 reps in reserve, RPE 8 is equivalent to 2 reps in reserve, and so on and so forth. So this is going to be a bit more of a personal and professional anecdote. So when it comes to asking an athlete to perform a weight at a certain reps in reserve, the athlete tends to be a little bit more conservative and less aggressive with regards to their jumps when finding out what their top set load is. So I think that when it comes to the reps in reserve scale, I think there's a bit more of a psychological element to it as well. So the idea of trying to keep a certain number of repetitions in reserve is going to be putting the mindset of the athlete into a slightly more conservative state than an aggressive state when it comes to using an RPE scale. So that's 12 ways on how to not overshoot your RPEs. If you guys did find any usefulness from this video, please click the like button. If you did have any other ideas for future videos, please comment in the box below. And as always, click like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell button.